Hey guys, welcome back to another episode with Method Ministries, and we're joined again. It's an honor and privilege to have Dr. Mark Olson back. Dr. Mark Olson, thank you for joining us again.
Hey, it's great to be with you, Lucas.
Same here. So he was on last time, just for the viewers, discussing John Wesley's view of justification by faith. So if you haven't watched the video, if you want to, you can. But today we're going to talk about eschatology, because you studied a lot, definitely a lot, on Wesley's view of eschatology, because you wrote a whole book on it that's bigger. You just told me that's bigger than your other book.
Yeah, this is it right here. Yeah, the size of it's a lot bigger. The publisher made it bigger, but still 400 pages. So
400, okay.
Yeah.
So you've been studying Wesley. I think last time you told me, what was it, 20 years or longer?
Yeah, my first publication on Wesley was in 2005, so 20 years ago. And then I did two other publications. And then I published this one, I think it was 2012, on his eschatology.
Believe it or not, I mean, that's 13 years ago.
Yeah.
You can believe it. I had to do some counting, because I feel like 2012 was not that long ago. But I'm like, oh man, it is.
I know, time flies by.
Yeah. But what made you want to write a book on this?
The reason why is that I recognize in my studies of Wesley that his views on eschatology are largely just ignored. In fact, Wesley is considered not even a main player in the field of eschatology, theologically, philosophy. And of course, nowadays, end times, all the popular books that are kicked out. I think back when I was a kid, the late great Planet Earth, back then in the early 70s was the big hot potato book that was out. Yeah. And of course, in the 1990s, you had the whole Left Behind series, but Wesley is, his expertise is really in the field of what we call soteriology, which is the doctrine of salvation and how salvation works in the believer's life and the path of salvation. But really, a lot of studies of his theology says very little about his eschatology. And yet, when you actually look at the history of early Methodism, eschatology was this pertinent, was a hot button issue back then. Yeah. And he does write a lot on the subject.
Okay, yeah. So, because when I try to find, I have his pamphlet on premillennialism, I want to say, or something about the end times. But we'll get into whether or not he was a post-mill or pre-mill, because that's battled out. But he definitely had unique views on eschatology that people don't know about, and also to just Protestant eschatology in general. Like, dispensationalism, as you mentioned, just has dominated since the 50s era or 60s era. And so it's really like all anybody really knows, and anything else sounds very foreign concept. And it's, we have really lost Protestant eschatology, because even the guys who are good at talking about Protestantism, they usually neglect historicism, which is what Wesley, held to as an interpretive hermeneutic, which, we'll get into all this stuff.
Yes.
But it definitely is unknown in many ways.
Yeah, it really is. Of course, dispensationalism was popularized in the 1800s. So after Wesley passed away. So, of course, Wesley lived in the 1700s. And the major background context of eschatology among Protestants was really the Reformation, the divide between Protestants and Catholics. It bled over into politics. You had all kinds of religious wars, political wars that went on. Europe was engulfed in a lot of religious wars in the 1600s. England, which that's where Wesley lived, England in the 1600s had a huge political divide between Catholics and Protestants. You had Catholic kings, yet the country became more and more Protestant in the parliament and everything. And so when he was born and when he lived and grew up in the 1700s, this fact, France, which was pro-Catholic, twice tried to invade England in Wesley's lifetime. And so the whole Protestant Catholic divide is the background behind his eschatology.
Okay, so I guess that's the perfect pivot to, I guess, give us an intro. Like what do we need to understand Wesley's eschatology?
Yeah. Well, let me just begin that the background is, and of course this relates to the whole Protestant Catholic thing, is the term religious nominalism. Okay, now what is nominalism? Well, it comes from the Latin word for name. So we're talking about people who are Christian in name only. And of course, back in the 1700s, you have all these state churches. And so, like in England itself, 90% of the population was baptized into the Church of England. And the other nations were the same way. So you have all these state churches, but people aren't living for Christ. They make no even attempt to live for Jesus. And so they were, religious nominalism was pervasive within all the state churches back then. And how does that relate to Wesley? Well, Wesley understood Paul's prophecy about the apostasy before Christ would return in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. He understood that to be the religious nominalism of his day. That as all you have all this state churches become very spiritually barren, and you got people who are baptized in the church, but they make no attempt to live the Christian life. That this is really the setting, the context that Paul was pointing to in their understanding of as this prophecy was coming true. And of course, they believed that the Pope was going to be the Antichrist too. That's their second part of it.
Well, and that's exactly, as I said, that's what people tend to either, they might neglect it for exactly that reason because it's controversial, right? To say the Pope is the Antichrist, that's very controversial today.
Yeah, well, the thing is that, of course, we live hundreds of years later.
Yeah.
And in our context, we usually are looking for some kind of political leader who's going to rise up and be the Antichrist, not the Pope. Because the Catholic Church today does not have the political power that it had back then. And so politics has changed, the world has changed. And that's one of the characteristics of prophecy and eschatology, is that everyone bases it on their current events and what's happening in the world around them. And as a result, prophecies, over time look very silly, interpretations of them. And on eschatology, because we realize that, society changes, the politics changes, political powers change, and all of a sudden the context doesn't really match anymore. It's just like the late great planet Earth. It was all about the Soviet Union. Well, the Soviet Union ceased to exist 30 years ago. And so it just, times change.
Yeah, they call that newspaper exegesis. You're basing it off. You're interpreting the Bible based upon today's news.
Yeah, that's right.
Everybody does that. Yeah, like you said, even on the opposite side, maybe preterism. Even they tend to do newspaper exegesis. They just do it through the lens of history books.
Well, here's the thing. If we believe we're living in the last generation, or we're living at that point when all the prophecies are about to take place, then how else are you going to interpret it? You're going to interpret it all with the day's events.
Exactly. Now, I know last time when we were talking about John Wesley's view of justification, you made the careful distinction to say, well, this is what Wesley believed, not what I believe. So are you close with what Wesley believed, or are you just like opposite?
No.
Or you're opposite?
No. Wesley is a post-millennialist. I'm not post-mill.
What are you?
And of course you mentioned historicism, which needs to be talked about here. But today historicism went on the wayside, a couple hundred years ago, after Wesley, of course, passed away. But in the 1800s, historicism started to just lose all of its luster to try to explain the book of Revelation, particularly.
Yeah, definitely. Before I ask you to explain historicism, are you a pre-mill then?
I am a very soft pre-mill, because I recognize that the only real passage in the Bible that directly discusses the millennium is Revelation chapter 20. And Revelation is a book of lots of symbolism. In fact, the book is symbolism is what dominates the book. So it's very easily to misinterpret. But I would fall into the pre-mill camp.
Same here. I'm a historic pre-mill. I'm a little, my grip on it has lessened. Like, I could be wrong. I could be an A-mill. I have even a little bit of pan-mill in me, because I recognize there's so much to know, and I don't know, and I'm gonna have to wait to see how it unfolds.
The reason why I'm a pre-mill is because I believe that in the book of Revelation, And chapter 19 ends with the second coming of Jesus Christ, and that leads right into chapter 20 with the millennium. That's the only reason why I'm a premill. I don't see it anywhere else really explicitly taught or emphasized anywhere else in the Bible.
Interesting. Okay. Well, so let's explain historicism, because this is the part, as I said, that it's lost. Like nobody, like even
Yes.
those, like even people who talk about Protestantism, they never talk about this, and I'm not even sure
Yeah.
anybody could even explain it. So let's get into that, because this is probably the key to understanding Wesley's view.
It is. It really is. Okay. Historicism is the belief that the book of Revelation, if we just talk about the book of Revelation, is that through all the symbolism, it's telling the history of the church age from the time of the apostles all the way up to the second coming. And of course, Wesley believed he was right around chapter 15 to 17. That chapters up, the first 14, 15 chapters are already fulfilled,
Hmm.
and which means that puts you right up close to the end because, chapter 19, you got the second coming and everything. And so he really kind of, he wasn't really, this is where he was really soft. He was not strong in trying making predictions. But he did see that the Pope was losing political power even in his day, which would really continue on in the 1800s when you got the birth of democracies. And that, he saw and he believed that and he believed in this concept of double millennium too. Now, this is going to throw people.
Oh yeah.
But historicism is the whole idea is that the symbolism of the book of Revelation is telling history. So you have a historical reading of it. So what you do, you take the symbols of Revelation and you tie it to events in history. So with Wesley, and this is a key line that I learned through studying his eschatology, is that the past is the key to the future. If you want to understand the future, how God's going to work in the future, look to the past because all the symbolism looks to the past and how church history is unfolded.
I just heard somebody explain it, historicism today, which I thought was pretty helpful. He says it's a playbook of history,
Yeah.
and not history just in the past, but in the future, as in like this is the whole program of God unfolding.
Yeah.
And that's how like Daniel's 70th weeks. Whether or not you believe the 70th week is future or not, that there's 490 years, and that's Daniel. Much of Daniel is functioning like that, like a playbook
Right.
of history. It's not just 7 years or 3 years; it's multiple years unfolding, and they they did view Revelation like that.
Well, see, now Wesley in his eschatology, he's following standard Protestant views. So when you start with Luther all the way up through the standard, historicism is the standard Protestant reading of Revelation. So Wesley he's in keeping with his times there. And he kind of, if you want to really understand it, he kind of niched together, the book of Daniel, which you have the five kingdoms.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and of course he had standard views that the fourth kingdom is the Roman Empire, and of course then you have God's kingdom comes in existence. Then you take the Olivet discourse like in Matthew 24 or Mark 13, Luke 21, and that kind of ties the history of Jesus' generation up to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. by the Romans, and then you have the book of Revelation, which takes it from there all the way up to the end. So that's how, like in my book, I actually diagram out his eschatology, beginning with the book of Daniel, all the way down through to the end, and how he understood the flow of history, salvation history, and the coming of the kingdom of God and its ultimate fulfillment at the second coming of Christ.
Do you know when historicism began in no pun intended in history?
No, I don't know exactly, but it's before the Protestants. But the Protestants really grabbed a hold of it and
Yeah, because
championed it.
in many ways, like, doesn't it not seem like that? Pretty much, you can find authors today who believe this. I have, but it's pretty much dead.
Yeah.
You think what do you think that says of Protestantism? Is it fair to say it's almost definitely a failed hermeneutic in many ways? Nobody really believes it because of current times, right? Going back to that newspaper exegesis, we look at the current state of Rome. No way is it fulfilling
Right, yeah.
Revelation.
See, the problem with the book of Revelation using historicism is that, the Protestants in the 1500s, well, they placed themselves right around chapters 15, 16, 17, and they interpreted all the symbolism before that to certain events. Well, then you get the ones who come the next century. Well, they reinterpret all the symbols to fit the events coming, because everybody places themselves right around chapters 15 to 17. And that means you totally keep reinterpreting. Every century reinterprets the prior chapters. Well, after 4 centuries of this, it's kind of like, hey, these things can mean anything. We can't hammer them down to really historical events that everybody agrees on.
And a lot of it seems far fetched. Like like a lot of historicists will say Revelation
Yeah.
10 is Martin Luther, and you just try to think about that, like what and like how do you get Martin Luther fitting into this section of scripture?
Well,
It's just
Luther at first he didn't like the Book of Revelation, but then he put out, he's writing his German translation of the New Testament and everything. Um, but at the end, towards the end of his life, he was fully convinced the Pope is the Antichrist, or a future one will be. And of course, the papacy is Babylon, and so that's the view of the Catholic Church. And you got to understand, back then, both Catholics and Protestants, it became politics, and they started having wars and fighting each other. It wasn't just theological discussion. And so, the nations, Europe was embroiled in this Protestant Catholic divide all the way up into the 1800s. That's when you get the birth of our modern era with modern democracies, modern economies. Our world is totally different than the world before 1800.
well, I will say it's not like completely. When we look at historicism, some people may think it's ridiculous, but when you actually understand the arguments, I will say they do have some good arguments. Like there was a time in my life where I did investigate it more.
Yeah.
There are some good arguments. Like if you go back to Martin Luther's day, the Pope, you could make it work. But like
It made sense.
Yes, like Second Thessalonians, like the man of God, the man of lawlessness is going to sit in the temple. That's the church. That's what the Roman Catholic Church did. I'm God. That's what he says.
Oh
And then
yeah. And
persecute.
you look at some of the titles that the Pope takes on, going back to, because the thing is, Wesley, this is standard Protestant views back then, is that you got the heathen Roman Empire, what we call the Roman Empire, and then this evolves into the papal Roman Empire, which you have the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
And the Catholic Church gained an enormous political power into the High Middle Ages. And so you can see why they would see it the way they did, because that's their world.
Yeah, and even with the 10 kingdoms, like I forget what time they pinpoint that in history, but there was 10 kingdoms came together and basically gave like the Pope power, and they say that was the rise of the man of lawlessness, or the Antichrist, or the beast. And so it's interesting. They do have some arguments for it, and maybe if I was in their time, I would probably believe it too.
Hey, it made sense back then. But also Wesley's day, premillennialism was starting to become popular. Charles definitely leaned towards premillennialism, but John's writings is post-mill, but he did read pre-mill writings in his day.
Okay, real quick though, so somebody, another Wesleyan scholar, pointed out to me, and he's right to say this, that Wesley's notes on Revelation were borrowed pretty much word for word from Johann Bengel, the Lutheran theologian. So do you think like Wesley was saying this is my definitive view, or he was just using that as a guide?
Okay, he would, his view, in my opinion, was that would be kind of like, hey, here's Bengel's, condensed down, and I don't have a better view. So he supports Bengel, but he says, I'm not going to defend it either.
Yeah, sort of like, and maybe that's why maybe some people don't latch on to him so much as an theologian for eschatology, because he's kind of open-handed in that regard.
In the sense of his notes on Revelation, now his notes on Daniel, he basically follows standard Protestant views and Matthew Henry's commentary, who he leans on there mostly.
Okay.
But like Wesley believed the revival going on, just like Jonathan Edwards. They all believed the revival that was going on was a prelude to the millennium. So, and their idea of the millennium was that basically the world's going to get converted to Christianity. So you got the mass conversion of the Jews, you have of Muslims, of Catholics, of the heathen out there. As they didn't have today we have a much more sense of the global world To them, the world was still being discovered in Wesley's
Mm.
day. And they were fascinated to learn about new cultures being, the South Pacific and all these kind of things. The world was still being, a lot of it was still unknown.
So you say so based upon that evidence, you argue that Wesley was a postmillennialist.
Oh yeah, no doubt about it. If you go by his writings, okay.
Okay.
Now he does read some pre-mill writings in the 1760s. He speaks well of them, but all his sermons and his writings and his commentary, it's all post-mill. And even even the series of commentators he leaned upon to write his commentary, his New Testament commentary, including Revelation, they were all post-mill.
Hmm.
And so it's very obvious that his sermon on the second coming of Christ and the last judgment, called the Great Assize, it reflects thoroughly a post-mill view of it.
Yeah, I think that's the one he mentions where the revival of his day is gonna keep getting bigger and bigger. Correct?
Well, that's actually in some of the other sermons. This one's
Okay.
the Great Assize. He talks about really the end of the world. Jesus Christ comes back and the whole, he talks about how there's going to be, tsunamis covering the earth all over. I mean, it's quite classic. I mean, the way he describes it, and that
Tsunami.
believers are going to be, in the commentary on Thessalonians, he says believers will be absolved. That's kind of like his word that kind of like vaporized, I guess, and we're going to meet the Lord in the air, and the final judgment is going to be in the air. And so you can read the sermon, and it's quite fascinating to read his views and his understanding of things.
So why do you think people argue that he was primo? So I don't really care, which one, like whatever John Wesley believed. But why do you think people argue whether he was primo or post mill?
Mostly because he read a popular pre-mill book in around 64, 63, 64, 1760s there. And he wrote a letter to the author, and he commends him and thanks him for, highlighting, a lot of the themes and, about the glorious kingdom of God coming and everything. But when it comes to his actual writings and what he wrote, it's all post-mill. I mean, his views on his views on animal redemption, we should talk about that.
Oh yeah.
But his views on the millennium and everything, it's all a post-mill vision.
Yeah, like when he preaches, he's optimistic, right?
Oh yes,
Yeah.
yeah. He believes that the church, that the evangelical revival. Jonathan Edwards, who's a Calvinist, believed the same way in America.
Yeah.
That the revival was so powerful, so potent. They believed this was going to usher in the end. It's going to usher in the millennium. That Christ is going to spiritually reign through the church in the sense of converting the world. And then after that, the second millennium was going to be the apostasy, the falling away, in Wesley's view. And then after that would come the second coming.
No, I think what people confuse when they hear postmillennialism, they confuse it with today's postmillennialism, which I call neo-postmillennialism, because even though he's post-mill, both post and pre-mill agree that the millennial is future. And so Wesley believed that it was future, not currently in it, and it was soteriological rather than coming through like law, right? Like a lot of post-mill today are theonomic. So they believe forcing God's law advances the kingdom. Wesley, like all the post-mills, believed it was coming through revival. Is that correct?
Oh yeah, that it would come through the evangelism. In fact, the post-mill vision that dominated early evangelicalism is what gave birth to the great century of Protestant missions in the 1800s. Because there's this core belief that God's is using the revival to bring the millennium, which is what? The Christianization of the world.
Yeah.
And so, Wesley's a number of things, what he writes about the revival and everything, really, you can see how it ties right into Protestant missions that really took off in the 1800s and was driven by that vision.
So what's this? So explain this crazy view that Wesley has of Revelation 20 that nobody has to my knowledge, really considered at all. I don't believe it either. You know, it's really hard to
Well, the
explain.
two
The
millenniums.
two millenniums, a dual
Yeah. Now, of
millennialism, they
course,
call it.
that is Bengal's view. What's interesting is that Bengal's not the first person to propose two millenniums.
Yeah.
In as I write about in my first chapter, which the first chapter of the book details eschatology from the 1500s up to the 1700s. So I give
Okay.
the history of English eschatology as the foundation for Wesley, and how it was all driven by this theme of religious nominalism. Okay, before it's the Protestants are the true Christians, the Catholics are the apostates. Okay, then you get Protestant groups back and forth. No, we're the true ones, and you're apostate. But anyways, this dual millennium. There was a guy by the name of Thomas Brightman, and he proposed two millenniums back in the 1500s. So Bengal is not the first person to propose it. The idea is that in Revelation 20, in the first 7 verses, you have the first millennium, in which, of course, John explicitly talks about the millennium there. And then you have this falling away. You got Gog and Magog, and everything unravels. Well, however much time that is, Wesley and Falling Bengal propose that that's going to be like another millennium in space of time. The thing is, in Revelation, it never really spells out how long is this final apostasy. How is it going to unravel? How is it going to work out? But Bengal put some years to it. Now, Bengal, you'd have to read his introduction. I mean, the guy was one of the world-renowned biblical scholars back in the 1700s, and he was a brilliant man. And he studied the heavens and everything, and he developed these concepts of time and relation to prophecy. I mean, it's just and world history. And so this is how he kind of put it all together. And Wesley was so mesmerized by Bengal's knowledge and his scholarship. And he was one of the leading biblical scholars of that day.
Wow.
And so Wesley was not, just going off the whim by putting Bengal's notes in Revelation. He's actually was just incorporating probably maybe the most prominent biblical scholar of his era.
Well, I remember now. Bengal made a prediction, not of Christ's return, but of when the millennial would begin or end. Right? Was that it?
Like Bengal predicted the papal Antichrist, the Pope Antichrist would be around 1836.
That's when it would end. Correct.
Well, no, that's kind of when it would begin.
Oh wait, really?
Yeah, kind of like the way they put it together. So
Why would it
really,
begin then? That's
by the time you get to 2 more millenniums, you're almost to the year 4000.
Yeah.
AD.
How does that work? Like why would he not say the Antichrist is prior?
Well, of course, it's with their historicism, the way they're reading Revelation. You got, and so everything of today kind of just bleeds into the millennium. And so you got this future Pope that's the Antichrist, because he gets destroyed, and that ushers in the millennium in the 1830s. Of course, you know what? We would look back and it's kind of laughable because of technology. Our world's changed so much in 200 years. They had no clue of seeing the technology, how the world would evolve in this terms of politics and nations and economics and weaponry and everything, transportation, everything we have today.
Yeah.
I mean, they proceed to just still be horse and buggy.
Yeah. So, what would you mentioned previously? He had a view on animals. I kind of know what you're talking about because I read one of his. I forget what I read, but can you explain that?
Yeah, it's in the Sermon of General Deliverance. And Wesley, in his later years, he read a lot of different philosophers. It's really called natural philosophy, which we today would just call science and scientists. So he's reading all these current scientists, scientists in his day. And so Wesley becomes convinced that animals have souls. Therefore, God's going to redeem them. And so that the future kingdom, heaven, Wesley pictures heaven and hell in very material terms. So the new heavens, new earth, well, it's going to be this earth, just renewed. Okay? Wesley believed that at the end of the book of Revelation, and also in Second Peter, where it talks about how God's going to be the great conflagration, where all the earth and everything's going to burn up. Wesley believed that everything's going to burn up, and everything's going to be kind of like melted down to its atomic structure, and then God's going to rebuild all of it, a new heaven, a new earth. And like he believed there won't be no comets, because in his day, comets was a sign of chaos and of the fall. So there are not going to be any comets in the new heavens and new earth. In fact, let me just throw this in the 1750s. Dr. Halley, who had the comet named after him, he was, tracking this comet, and he made the prediction it was coming back in 1757. And he also made the prediction that it's going to be very likely that the Earth was going to travel through the tail of this comet, and it would burn up all the parts of the Earth. And so the 1750s was just a hotbed of eschatology. People believed they were living in the end times. It was the end. I mean, the world's going to the end.
Sounds like now.
Oh, I know. It was just, and that tied into Wesley's perfectionism too, because you had the perfectionist revival break out around 1760, and you had George Bell saying the world's ending, and we're as perfect as the angels now. We've attained perfection, and all this kind of stuff. I mean, it was wild. It was a wild time.
Yeah, that's it's funny because we think like only recently have we become crazy with end times, but there was even craziness even prior. I even know, actually, I think it was Dr. Snowden in World War I. The post-millennialists were very optimistic that soon the world would just get better, and technology was increasing, medicine was increasing. They thought the millennial was upon them too, and then insert 2 world wars, and that just devastated everybody, and that played a part in the switchover.
Hey, Lucas, you make a good point about how prophecy views develop, because in the 1800s, the post-mill view takes on a very social and political element as it approaches the 1900s, and the world's going to get better, and Christianity is, of course, going to be kind of like the bedrock of this better world. And of course, then World War I started. And then World War II just shattered all this dream of utopia.
Oh, yeah. And that's why dispensationalism took over so well, and because they capitalized on this. Because
World War II just shattered so many dreams. Even World War I did. But World War II was like icing on the cake. The whole world was engulfed in war. And we had this, the Cold War and the Korean War and Vietnam. I mean, it's just, climactic times.
Oh, yeah, and a lot of liberals took over post-mill side, and the conservatives were going pre-mill as well. And so it's interesting. Why do you think, kind of related to this conversation, why do you think dispensationalism now seems to be losing? I don't know if this is accurate or not, but there's a lot of people online going after it. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on dispensationalism.
I don't really keep up with all the trends today on these things as a scholar, and I'm more a historical scholar with historical theology. But my general view is that often these movements, they get very popular. They're like the new idea out there. Everyone just thinks it's cool and everything, but they kind of lose their steam over time, even if it takes 100, 150 years. And I think that the top dispensation was most popular beginning, it was like in the 1950s and 60s, and ever since then it's been kind of like losing steam. Even though you had the Left Behind series come out, and I think a lot of it is that I know I left dispensationalism back in the 70s and 80s.
Oh wow!
As a young Christian, because I just saw that it did not really line up with Scripture.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like an arbitrary format imposed on Scripture to make you read it a certain way. But it doesn't really flow out of the scriptural narrative and scriptural teachings.
Sorry, I was going to silence my phone over here.
and you know what? A lot of the prophecy gurus, I remember 1980, Hal Lindsey, 1980s was the countdown to Armageddon. And the 1980s was not the countdown to Armageddon. You can see how it loses steam. You don't have confidence. They just keep pumping out one book after another.
Oh, I know. and it all comes about the rapture too. Everybody, a lot of it's always just the rapture, the rapture, the rapture. We're getting closer, we're getting
Yeah.
closer and close, and I think a lot of people are realizing, you can only keep saying that for so long
Yeah.
until we start to realize, wait, what's going on over here?
Yeah, once you abandon dispensationalism, the rapture does not become like, the timing of the rapture is just with the second coming. And when
Exactly.
you actually look at the writings in the New Testament, that's exactly how it portrays it.
Yep.
And that
Yep.
was one of the key issues for me, biblically speaking, um, that I could see that the whole pre-trib view was really built on sand. It was not there does not sound biblical exegesis behind it.
Well, you studied historic, theology or eschatology, and would you agree that the pre-trib rapture was kind of is missing? Like nobody had this concept.
Oh, you know what? It's Darby who made that
Well,
the view.
prior to Darby, I
Yeah, but
mean,
prior to Darby, the premillennialism, there was no pre-trib.
exactly.
It
Yes.
was everything was what we would call today the post-trib view of the rapture, which
Yep.
was the standard view of the rapture going all the way back to the apostles. It's Darby who came up with this novel concept in the 1800s.
But they didn't even call it post-trib. It was just, and maybe not even the rapture, because
No, there
rapture just
wasn't. There
means
was no because there was
it's
no
just
different views
resurrection.
of the rapture. The
Yeah.
rapture just happens when Christ returns.
Yeah. The word rapture consumes the word resurrection, so we think they're distinct. But it just means resurrection, and we have to
Yeah.
think of it like that rather than just this, formulation on a map of when it
Yeah.
happens.
Now, Wes, I jotted down some of the different points on here. Of points we've talked about historicism, the papal antichrist, the two millenniums. If we want to go more, animal redemption. We talk about the revival, his post-mill views. Another thing that Wesley adopts that was very, very popular, that became very strong in Protestant views of eschatology, is the conversion of the Jews.
Oh yes, let's talk
And
about
that
that.
really led, believe it or not, in the 1500s and 1600s, it led England to open its doors for Jews who were not being welcome in other nations in Europe. They could immigrate to England
Hmm.
and find a home there and find safety there. And one of it is because in English eschatology became very dominant, this belief about the conversion of the Jews. So we need to help the Jews. And it's interesting, it's the English government that helped England become a nation in 1948.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I'm glad you brought that up, because that is also key for postmillennialism, because they believed when the Jews are converted, that inaugurates the millennial kingdom.
Oh yeah, this is one of the
Yep.
key signs of the end is the conversion of the Jews, and
Now,
so they were.
I'm sorry, I was going to say, how did Wesley understand that differently? Because when people hear that, they automatically think going back to dispensationalism, right? Or that's that's what dispensationalist. So, how did was there any differences in thought between dispensationalists believing a future for Jewish conversion versus Wesley and the Protestants?
Well, I just in my research years ago was this idea of the conversion of Jews just really started to percolate in English eschatology. So it predates Wesley. and and so the English government and as a nation they just became much more favorable in their view of the Jews and the Jewish people, and of course then you get the birth of Zionism starts to develop, which of course leads through to the birth of the nation of Israel in our modern times. But I'm not really sure. Like with Darby, I'm not really sure the difference between his views and the English views on conversion of the Jews. Except that Darby, of course, he has this dispensationalist view that he imposes on the text of the Bible to make certain verses read different ways. And of
Yeah.
course, they didn't accept that kind of reading.
Yeah. Well, do you think that Wesley held that it would be the Jews as a nation, or did he just believe in Jews in general, like wherever they were?
No, there's no nation, so they would just been the Jewish people, a mass conversion of Jewish people.
Got it. Yeah, because when I read his notes on Romans 11, like he talks about in verse 18, he says, when Paul says, "Don't be arrogant towards the branches," speaking of Jews,
Yeah.
Wesley makes a point that you're breaking this if you deny their conversion, which is again like a key point for
Right.
his
Yeah.
eschatology.
So it was very And of course, I have in this book, in my book, I have this is a reader, so I have what his sermons, his commentary notes, everything in here, and about that spells out his different views.
Okay.
But yeah, it was a very popular view. Another thing that most people are not going to realize, this is another kind of like a background thing to Wesley's eschatology, and it has to do with animal redemption too, is the philosophical concept called the great chain of being. And people need to Google that and look it up because it goes all the way back to Plato and Aristotle and becomes a kind of like a dominant worldview on how to understand the created order. You got God at top. Of course, you have the angelic realm, and you have humans, you have animals, and then of course you have plants, and you have the minerals. You have this chain. And they even did it with human society. You have the king at top, you have your nobles, etc., all the way down to your peasants. Everything is in an order. And as long as the order was maintained, you have harmony. And of course, so this is why so much of even England in the 1700s was almost like a caste system. I mean, if you were born, if your father was a farmer, you would be a farmer. I mean, that's, today we live in a totally different world. People, we migrate in our jobs, our careers, we're open-ended. But when you get back in the pre-modern period of time, society was very structured and almost like a caste system. That's how we would look at it. And from our modern viewpoint, but this great chain of being philosophy guides Wesley's understanding on how the new kingdom is going to take place, how animal redemption, it's all tied to this philosophy called the great chain of being.
So just to refresh my memory on that. So when he says they have souls, that means new heavens and new earth. Every animal that lived will be there redeemed.
Well,
does it have
that's how I poke fun at it. Because of course I don't believe in it. Because like people with pets often want their pets to be in heaven with them. But basically he pertained it to animals that have more of a consciousness to them and can feel pain. In the great chain, those who are more closer up to human beings in the link. Now it's interesting because this predates evolution. Okay, it's in the 1700s that naturalists, as they would organize all the different strata of life things according to this chain. And what they put right next to human beings was apes, because they already recognize the similarities between humans and apes in so many different ways, which in the 1800s is going to build on that with the theory of evolution, whether we agree or disagree with it. That's kind of, you can see how science took this basic idea and started to build on it.
Well, actually, it's funny you mentioned that. I just finished Augustine's The City of God, and I was surprised to learn that he mentioned some people teaching that very thing himself all the way back then.
Oh, yeah, the great chain is dominant. Augustine would have adopted it. It's the basic worldview and how they understood that the structure of everything, the created order and everything, all realities structured together.
Yeah. By the way, so I don't know if you're familiar with Joseph Benson notes on the Book of Revelation, or if you read his notes. He's a famous.
I published his commentary on the New Testament. It's on my website.
Oh, you did? Okay.
I have not studied them though.
Okay, because I was going to ask a question, because he also had a strange view on Revelation, the millennial as well, where he basically says the millennial, it sounds like he's pre-mill, but then also he defines it as it's in heaven. And then I'm trying to formulate, how does he work that out with the second coming of Christ, and when does that happen? So I was just trying to see if you would have an answer on that.
Well, for example, of course, Charles leaned pre-mill, and then you got John Fletcher, who's looked upon kind of like the first theologian of early Methodism, with his 5 checks of antinomianism. But Fletcher, he believed in almost like 3 comings of Christ. he just kind of had a pre-meal mixed with a post-meal view. And you can see how people had all kinds of ideas, how they would try to put it together.
How does Fletcher get three comings?
Well, the thing is, sometimes a coming becomes more of a spiritualized coming.
Like 80-70, you mean? Like
type of thing. I'd have to go back and read his letter. Okay. He wrote a letter to John Wesley in the 1750s, which he expresses some of his views on eschatology. and
Mm.
he definitely kind of espouses this, like almost like a three comings of Christ. But really, when you talk about coming to Christ, what do you mean by that? See,
Yeah.
and so he's not talking about three physical comings of Christ.
Yes.
It'd be like three spiritual comings. So it'd be like a spiritual coming to Christ that brings the first millennium in, because it's the grace of Christ and Christ's lordship over the church that Christianizes the world, and it's Christ reigning through the church type of a thing.
Okay. Now, now? What's the evidence for? Why is it like everybody's kind of more, firm on the fact that Charles was a pre-mill?
Well, Charles in the 1740s, what happened in the 1745 is that France, well, what it is, okay, a little bit of English history here. In 1790, the English basically boot out the Catholic king, King James. He's kicked out of the country. They invite a Protestant king to come in and be the king. Parliament does. So you have this, there's no war or anything. But what happens is that the true king, who had been King James, he goes to France. That's pro-Catholic because he's staunch Catholic. And then of course, he has kids. He has a family line. Well, his family line are looked upon by many as the true royalty, the king of
Mm.
England, and that those who came in, well, they're kind of like usurpers. They're not really the true king. And so what happens is that King James' descendants twice invade England to try to take the throne. One around 1815, somewhere around then. And then the last time was in 18, I mean, not 18, but 1715, I think it was. And then 1745. And
Okay.
so you got to think Charles is studying prophecy at that time. And of course, with the whole thing, what's happening, and you know what? The invasion was almost successful. I mean, it was eventually defeated as it got closer to London, but it was very close to being successful.
Wow.
And
Is
so you can see how they, with their politics and their views and everything. And then, of course, Charles was reading premillennial works, and he becomes convinced of the premillennial perspective. And I
okay.
also understand this, even though I haven't studied it. I also understand that Samuel Wesley, their father,
I was going to say
was
that.
premillennialist,
Yeah.
and I've gotten that knowledge, that view, understanding from Randy Maddox's works.
Yes. I remember that too. No, but and also too, it's important to keep in mind is that really these pre-mill post-mill differences, they're not actually too far apart when you
No, they
understand
really aren't. Not back
because
then.
because of historicism. Because you really the difference was they would all agree that, like you said, up till 15, chapter 15, 16 of Revelation, that's all fulfilled. The difference is the millennial here. They both say it's future. They just say, when does Christ come? Where
That's
today,
right.
pre-mill and post-mill is more divided, but back then it was just a matter of, even for the on-mill, of how you interpret that one chapter. That was it. So it
Yeah,
wasn't that big of a
you're right,
deal.
Lucas. You're right. The differences between the two were not that great, and they're quite compatible. And so it's really when dispensationalism comes into play in the 1800s and becomes popular in the latter part of the 1800s that you get a much more radical disjuncture between the two schools of thought. And the post-mill view really evolved into a more political, social view. It loses its conservative Christian, evangelicalism. That's all gets lost and becomes totally, politics and social transformation of society.
Why do you think that that took over? Like, why did post-mill go from being soteriological to political?
Because I think that conservative. Okay, one of the things is that you start to get the split between conservatives and liberalism in the 1800s. Because you got the theory of evolution comes out, begins splitting people, and you just got different views about because you got modern society coming shaping and modern views of society and everything. And of course, liberalism is the embracing of all this, what's called modernism. And the conservative Christian says, no, we got to stay with the gospel. We got to stay with, the biblical worldview, et cetera, et cetera. And so you get this split. And so the conservative Christians gravitate towards the premillennial dispensationalism views. and the post mill, well, there are the liberal, and they become more of, you know, social changes, political changes type of a thing. That's how I see it in a nutshell.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting to think of how that so much change happened just like 100 years later
Yeah,
with
it really
that.
did. Because what happens is, starting in the early 1800s, is you get the birth of modern democracy. I mean, the
Mhm.
United States is the first, but democracy starts to spread throughout Europe, and of course, it continues on throughout around the world. You also get modern economies and capitalism that really didn't exist before. You get industrialization, which starts to change everything, how we make things, manufacture things. The whole world begins to change into the world that we have today. So the average person today has no clue how life was before these mega trends.
Yeah, and even how churches it was functioned
Oh yeah,
differently than today.
yeah.
Like try to, one interesting feature is unrelated to this, but kind of along the lines of our topic is grape juice. Prior to the 19th century, everybody just used wine, and we think everybody used grape juice like us, but that was actually a modern invention due
Oh, it
to
is. In
political
fact, the
factors.
communion cup, the individual communion cup was invented in the 1890s.
Oh my god, I didn't even know that. Wow.
Oh yeah.
Well, because the temperance movement took over, and Thomas Welcher's grape juice was
Oh yeah.
invented by a Methodist because they believe alcohol should be not, it's a sin. Just period, like not drunkenness, just alcohol. Don't drink it.
Yeah. In
Yeah,
fact, you know what? This is really on a side note, but when you even look at the evolution of evangelism, how we do evangelism today compared to Wesley's day, it's like apples and oranges. And you sit and think, well, like Charles Finney came along in the 1820s, emphasizing making decisions, and how evangelism today is built upon that whole concept. Well, Finney, he was born and raised in the country of democracy. People voted for their leaders. But you go back before that, no one's voting for your leaders. And so you don't have decision making in evangelism. Wesley didn't go out and make decisions for Jesus.
yeah. He preached the new birth and repentance, right?
Yeah, they preached a new birth, and then they would invite people to the societies, and they put them in classes, and people would wait until they received the witness of the Spirit in their heart. Well, it
Yeah.
took Wesley a month to receive his,
Mm.
and it took Charles about 2-3 weeks. Some people waited a long time.
That's
Um,
why. That's why also he told people to pursue the means of grace as
oh
well.
yes, yeah, yeah. That's why, yeah, you stay in the means of grace, because that would make you more, available to God,
Yeah.
converting grace coming into your heart.
Yeah. That a much better mindset than we reduce Christianity down to, and I talked about this yesterday when I was preaching, to just one moment. Like Christianity is all about just justification by faith. That one time you believe, and that's
Yeah,
when it stops, and that's it. But it's
it is.
holistic.
Yeah, it gets watered down, is what it does. And
Yeah,
even, when you look at, it's interesting to study the history of evangelism from the days of Finney in the 1820s all the way up to our modern period. How decision making has evolved too.
oh
Finney's
yeah.
concept of making a decision is not how we do it today.
I will say though, speaking of Finney, I do like a lot of what he says because I purposely tried to read him lately just to get
Yeah. Oh, I used
'cause
to be an avid reader of Finney.
oh, really? So, because
Oh yeah.
I think he's great on a lot of things. He
Oh
did
yeah.
deny original sin. I will admit that. That's a bad doctrine to deny. Oh, that's not a good thing to deny. Original sin is scriptural.
Well, my read of Finney is that yes, he denied original sin, but really, how he develops it all theologically, he just reaffirmed it. Just doesn't want to use the language of it.
He-
And the reason
mm,
why too is that he opposed what we'd call high Calvinism. Finney did. Now he's a Calvinist, but he opposed a really high Calvinist that was so dogmatic and no one had any free will, and so he went into churches and began preaching, and all these people are waiting for God to save them at some time in their life. And he says, "Well, what are you waiting for? Decide right now."
Wait, you said he's a Calvinist because
Oh, he was. Yeah, he believed in perseverance of the saints.
I know that.
And
Which I was surprised to learn about that, but I
but
always thought he believed in conditional election.
okay. what's very interesting about Finney's views is that, yeah, he even has basically a Calvinist view of election, basically, but he does believe that a person can lose their salvation, and he believes in perseverance. So he has this bridge theology. So he has some Arminian elements in him, and he has Calvinistic elements, and that's the reason why Calvinists don't like him and Arminians don't like him.
Well, see, I was surprised to find, because I have a systematic. I was surprised to find he taught perseverance of the saints, and he argues very Calvinistically. But when I read him on conditional, or maybe not conditional election, but something, I read him on something, and I was like, yeah, he's definitely in the Arminian camp. I just thought he was being inconsistent with perseverance of the
But he's
saints.
not totally an Arminian camp. See,
Yeah, correct.
he's Arminian in the sense of how he approaches his evangelism. We'd say he's
Yeah.
Arminian in our viewpoint. Um, he was accused of being Pelagian.
Oh
I
yeah.
mean, yeah.
He probably was.
And then of course, he believes that people can lose their salvation. And you say, well, how does that? And yet he argues for chapters, for several chapters for perseverance of the saints. And you say, well, how does he reconcile the two? Well, what he does is he does believe people can lose their salvation, but if they're truly ever really regenerated, God will eventually reclaim them, bring them back to repentance. He was so adamant against all this easy Christianity and you can live any which, because he was a staunch believer in holiness.
Hmm.
That if people aren't living the holy life, well, then they lose their salvation. But if they're ever really truly born again, God will eventually bring them back.
Yeah, that
I
definitely.
don't know which edition you have of his systematic theology, because some of the older editions of it, they edited out all his chapters on perseverance of the saints, on
Really.
election, and all this stuff. His Truth and Heart publisher, it's a small publisher who published my first few books. It's a 2-volume set of his systematic theology of Finney's, and it contains all the chapters.
Okay, I got to read him again on election,
Yeah.
just to understand. So you're saying that he taught unconditional election?
Well, Finney would have believed basically, I'd have to go back and read it again too, because it's been a number of years. But he could basically support a Calvinist view of election. Um, but he would not be a strong, heavy, he's not a limited atonement. Like he believes in general
Oh yeah,
atonement.
yeah.
And so he'd be classified a moderate, a soft Calvinist, you would say.
Okay, interesting. I never heard that take. I'm wondering if people are thinking, well, how do we get talking from eschatology to Charles Finney?
I know we kind of left Wesley behind.
We're totally off topic right now.
Because that's the way eschatology is, though. It's how people fit in their periods of time and how it's evolved and changed, from generation to generation, from century to century.
And this is why I do think, ever here, like I'm sure you heard of the term panmillennialist. It's all going to pan
Yeah.
out in the end. I do, it's funny to say this, but I think there is a case for panmillennialism, not fully, but like there is, when you look at all these arguments for eschatology and the history of it, a lot of them have good arguments. And it's like there's so much factors that I don't know exactly how the end is going to go down, other than Christ is coming back, he's going to resurrect us. And the Jews are going to be converted. And the Antichrist is coming. I think those 4 things are rooted in Scripture and also the early church. So those 4 things I'm convinced of. Like the rest of the things, how the content of what that's actually going to look like. There's so much I don't know.
Well, when you look at early Christianity, you look at like the early creeds, they affirm very basic truths.
Yes.
That, Christ is going to return. There's going to be a final judgment. There's heaven and there's hell. And then, of course, with Paul's teaching in Romans, you got the conversion of the Jews. But the church fathers, everything, they just left it to basics. And it's been open-ended. And ever since then, there's been so many different views. And I appreciate, because a lot of times the different perspectives help us to think outside the box, because we all can get kind of like tunnel vision on this subject. And but like preterism, I appreciate that it teaches us to root the scriptures in the context of the first century. I mean, I'm a firm believer that Revelation and all the apostolic writings on end times needs to be understood in the context of the first century of the Roman Empire, because that's to who all these writings were written to. There's people living then. And where I disagree with a lot of preterists, they kind of want to turn the book of Revelation into the transition from the old covenant to the new covenant type of a thing. And yet, when you read the apostolic fathers and that, no, they believe that when Jesus is talking, in all of a discourse, he's talking about his second coming.
Yeah.
And so, the belief in Christ's second coming is very strong in the second century.
Yeah, even with the Olivet Discourse too, they like the Didache was interpreting that as future prior to Christ's return, like right up into prior to Christ's return too. Like there's a strong, the early church fathers, and a lot of people don't know this too. Even Irenaeus taught a 7-year tribulation, and Politius did as well. People think that's dispensationalism, and against heresies, Irenaeus talks about a 7-year tribulation from Daniel's 70th week, which a lot of people they'll be shocked by that. They think, oh, that's dispensationalism. It's prior to it, actually. Way prior.
Well, I didn't know that. So you just taught me something new today.
Yeah. Well, they were premills for sure. And again,
Yeah, the premill view is very strong among the Apostolic Fathers.
I actually think that's an argument.
And the Ante-Nicene Fathers. The premill view, and then the all-millennials view is what kind of evolves with my time. After Constantine and you get Augustine, the all-mill view is what really kind of becomes dominant.
Yes. Well, we had an hour mark. Is there anything that we didn't touch upon, or anything you want to say, before we close? I can't believe.
No, well, we covered a lot of ground here. Hopefully it's been helpful. I just would walk through the basic views. People should check out the Great Chain of Being by Googling that. Wesley's historicism is very key in how he understood reading of like Revelation, Daniel, and these scriptures. Of course, the Antichrist is going to be a pope. You got the conversion of the Jews, his post-millennialism with the conversion of the world and conversion of the Jews, and how the revival, this is a big thing. They saw the revival as the prelude to it all, introducing all of it. This concept of animal redemption and very material view of the new heavens and the new earth, and the 2 millenniums. And also, finally, he understood the kingdom of grace and kingdom of glory. We're kingdom of grace now, in the future be the kingdom of glory. That comes up in his parables, teaching on the parables.
Oh, is that another way to talk about the eternal state?
Well, yeah. Right now, of how the kingdom of God is coming in our world. So, with the first coming of Christ, you have the kingdom of grace. God and His grace reigns in our lives. In the future, with the second coming, you have the kingdom of glory, where Christ will be physically reigning in the new heavens and the new earth.
Okay, interesting. And bonus too, we even talked about Charles Finney.
Yeah. Yeah, we actually got quite a bit of material into this hour discussion today.
Are you writing currently any books or thinking of any projects to write next?
My next project, I'm waiting to hear from the publisher really to okay it, but I want to write a sequel to my book on justification. It'd be on his doctrine of sanctification.
Really?
Use the same format and everything, and it's a chronological, comprehensive study of Wesley's doctrine of sanctification, how it developed, how his views take shape, and be fascinating.
You said sanctification or justification?
Sanctification. It would be a parallel volume to my volume on justification.
Got it. Okay, because I know you did one on entire sanctification, right?
Well, I have written one of my early studies. It's called John Wesley's Theology of Christian Perfection.
Yeah. Okay.
That is also a study on how his doctrine of Christian perfection develops. But I got 20 more years of research completed, and so I can add maybe my more latest thoughts to the subject.
Or maybe you can write one on Charles Finney.
Oh, I've thought about it.
I would love that because he's
Finney's a fascinating character.
He really is, and I think he needs to be defended sometimes. A lot of times.
I do too.
And he's misunderstood. In particular, I like his view of the governmental theory of atonement. Right.
Well, and of course, Wesley was not he was not fond of the governmental view. Wesley, of course, the governmental view goes back to Hugo Grotius, which is just an adaptation of is an adaptive view of the penal substitution view. But Wesleyans and Armenians really grabbed a hold of the governmental view in the 1800s.
Yeah, that was a I feel like Wesley was a precursor to that in many ways. Like there was a governmental motif, whether he acknowledged it or not, in his thinking with his denial of imputation of Christ's righteousness.
Well, yeah, it's another thing. He doesn't really deny the imputed righteousness of Christ. He
Mhm.
denies the Calvinist version of it.
Correct.
And
Yes.
so he, when it comes to his views, I mean, he believes in penal substitution theory. That is a standard view in Anglican theology, and he's Anglican, so he just adopts it. But he has an Arminian interpretation of it, not a Calvinist interpretation. So he believes
Yes.
that Christ purchased a general atonement for everybody, that God's prevenient grace is reaching out to everybody, as opposed to the Calvinist view, which is viewed to the tides of election. God decides in eternity who he's going to save, and that's the only people Christ died for.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. Well, thank you again, Dr. Olson, for joining us. It was a pleasure last time and a pleasure this time, and you're really, knowledgeable on this too. So I definitely appreciate that.
Yeah, so, well, anytime, Lucas. Maybe we should talk about the atonement next time.
Maybe we should and do another one on Charles Finney and like see if we can get into some weeds with
Oh,
common
you
objections.
want to talk about Finney, man? I would love it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We should definitely do that. That'd be fun and I think helpful too, because like I said, like there's a lot of objections out there towards him, and a lot of people call him heretics. I think that's
Yeah.
unwarranted, even though I disagree with him on points.
Well,
I
I
still think,
disagree with Finney too.
yeah,
But like I said, I think on a lot of things, what his context, what he was trying to, wrestle with and argue against, he's trying to stay clear of the high Calvinist theology that dominated the churches in which he was preaching,
yeah, that's an interesting point.
trying to move people towards God because they were just stagnant, just
Yeah,
sitting there.
yes, nominalism, and Wesley too. Nominalism was what they were vouching,
Oh
fighting
yeah,
against.
nominalism. Yeah.
Yeah,
See, we live in a totally different context today in our
we do.
secularized world. I mean, it's it
Post Christian.
really we have religious nominalism today, but it's not like what they were facing.
Yes, exactly. Well, yeah, thank you again to the viewers. If you can please hit the like button, helps the algorithm push a video out. Share this, subscribe, and also I'll link Dr. Olson's book in the description of this video. So if you want to read this book and also check out his other books, he has a lot of books on similar topics. And thanks again for tuning in. This has been another episode of Signing Off. Take care and God bless.